Campside Media.
Hey, Campside listeners. Welcome to Inside the Tent, our series where we go behind the microphone of our hit podcasts, old and new, like this one, which is just out. I'm Josh Dean, one of the co-founders of Campside Media and a voice you might recognize as the host of some of our shows. But today I'm talking about a show I just worked on as a producer. It's the latest season of Witnessed, called Night Shift, hosted by the great Jake Adelstein. If that name sounds familiar, you might remember him from our show, The Evaporated, which he made with his reporting partner, Shoko Plambeck. Or you might know it because he wrote the book Tokyo Vice and became a prominent character in the TV series on HBO Max that came from that book, played by Ansel Elgort. Jake is a great reporter who grew up in Missouri, but has spent his entire career in Japan. And for this series, he went back home to tell a story in his own backyard, in a sense about his own dad. It's the story of a series of suspicious deaths at the VA hospital in Jake's hometown, Columbia, Missouri, which all seem to be connected to a single nurse. And Jake's dad was asked to help solve the mystery. Where it goes from there, you'll just have to listen. If you want more content about our hosts and shows, head over to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com. Now here's my conversation with Jake. So you're based in Japan, and this story is not. What made this the story that brought you back to America?
Well, in some ways, it is the success of The Evaporated, which we previously did together on Campside Media, that brought it back because my father listened to the podcast, which, and believe me, my father never reads my books. He barely reads my articles. Sometimes he reads my Twitter, but he listened to the whole podcast and he was like, hey, that was actually really good.
Actually really good.
Yes. As if like, hey, son, did you know the dog could speak here? Like he's going to speak to you right now. That kind of tone. And he was like, you should really revisit the VA murders because that's a fascinating story that could really benefit from having someone come back and take a look at it, even after all these years have passed. And there's not many people who are still left alive who can talk about it. I am one of them. I have sort of been following that story for years, ever since my father first started talking about it to me. And I was like, well, at the time we started this, all the work for Tokyo Vice Season 2 had been done, wasn't working on a new book. And I was like, this is a great opportunity to revisit this mystery that has meant so much to my father and his friends. And so I asked you what you thought, and you were like, this is interesting. We ran a proposal. And then I was like, let's be honest here. I lack some objectivity on this story because my father is the one who began this crazy investigation in a way. And I'm like, I need someone to balance this with this. And I also need someone who's really hardworking and good at writing scripts. And of course, Shoko Plambeck from The Evaporated and her amazing sister, Amy Plambeck, I was like, do this with me. Come with me to Columbia, Missouri, meet my father, explore this mystery. We're a great team. And so they agreed and off we went. It's
almost unbelievable that someone who writes about crime as much as you do could have been living with this story in a sense all those years. Because I think like most of us who cover crime some of the time or a lot of the time have like far and away mined all the stories that came close to our lives or that we had a chance to like investigate or have access to. And yet here's this one that was like basically sitting in your backpack. You've just been carrying it around in your backpack for 40 years. Did you ever think about it before?
I mean, I thought about it for years. I mean, especially my father had all the files, right? In his office. I'd go to visit him. Columbia, Missouri is far from every airport. I mean, there's a Columbia, Missouri airport now, actually, that's pretty serviceable. But most of the time I go to St. Louis and I take a bus back called the Mo Express. And so I was on the Mo X once, which is how we abbreviate it. And the driver says to me, like, hey, I see your name is Adelstein. It's okay. It's pronounced Adelstein, but everybody calls.
Something I learned on the podcast, by the way. After knowing you for multiple years, I had no idea that it was Adelstein.
It is Adelstein. It is Adelstein. I'm not German, so forgive my pronunciation if it's a little off, but it's Adelstein. I just got a letter from my sister who listened to the trailer, and she's like, why are you pronouncing it like that? And I'm like, it's because that's how it's supposed to be pronounced. Anyway.
Maybe the most important journalism this podcast did is that the Adelstein family will finally say its name correctly.
In the series Tokyo Vice, the fictional version of me is Adelstein, right? And I was like, no, it's Adelstein. But they'd already filmed some of it, and they were like, no, it's going to be Adelstein, and you have to stop calling yourself Adelstein. And I was like, I can't make that promise, but I understand the dilemma there.
Okay, back to the bus.
Back to the bus driver says to me, like, hey, yes, your name is Adelstein. Are you Eddie Adelstein's son? And I'm like, yeah, you know my father? And he says, yeah, as a matter of fact, I know your father really well. So he begins to tell me about his side of the suspicious deaths at the VA hospital years ago, and how the FBI came and they talked to him, and how he was basically asked to be on a committee to get rid of my father because he was a whistleblower, and how he decided not to do it. And I was like, that is amazing. And I said, listen, can I tape this? Because you never know when you're going to use these things. He's like, sure. So I turned on my little iPhone recorder and we're taping this. And first of all, it was really nice that he stood up for my father, because there was nothing in it for him and that didn't help his career. And then I listened to this and I said, yeah, this is one of the most bizarre stories that most people don't know. They don't know because it's never been completely resolved, right? There's no closure to this story, which is one reason it doesn't make a good TV movie. Everything is left up in the air, and it doesn't leave it has a bitter taste that it's left in the mouth of people for 30 years now. But I was thinking, okay, I've got this recording. I really need to do this story someday. This is my hometown, and I know most people don't come back to their hometown, but this is the kind of story, if I was a reporter in Japan, I would definitely cover. But why am I not covering it? Because it's old, because I live in Japan, so I don't live in Missouri. There are lots of things, but I do remember that I was so touched by what the driver said that I gave him $50, because thank you for going out on a limb for someone you didn't have to go out on a limb for. And then over the years, I've been going through my dad's files and looking at things and reading the documents. And I did one very small article for the Daily Beast years ago when the VA hospital was in the news right before Memorial Day or something. And, I just waited. And when we were thinking of what were podcasts we could do, and I asked you what you thought about it, and the response was so positive. I was like, all right. I mean, I can't really say that, there was one thing, but really it was actually the success of The Evaporated and my father saying, hey, it wasn't so bad. It was actually really good. You should do the story. That I was like, okay, what can it hurt? I'm going to write to Josh Dean and see what he says.
I mean, it's a very good reason. We often get pitched crime stories a lot because they do well in audio, and often the question is, well, there's two. One is why now? The other one is like, why you? Because there's a lot of just trolling the world for interesting stories of kidnappings and cold cases and serial killers. And you don't want to get into the business of just doing it for entertainment's sake. And so this one had the perfect answer, that there was the personal connection. But I mean, you mentioned Shoko and needing kind of an objectivity check. People can listen to the podcast, and I don't want to get into the details of the case for this conversation, but I am kind of curious what it was like working with someone in your family, like your dad as interview subject and source of information.
Well, here's the interesting thing, and this is one of the reasons I brought Shoko and Amy along, or I begged them to come. Actually, when we were looking at our budget, I gave them the bigger share of the budget because they're going to be doing a lot of work, and I really wanted to get this done. It's a labor of love. But the thing is, my father and I know this story. We know all the characters, right? So it's kind of like having two neurosurgeons talking about a surgery they're doing, or like me talking about, Yakuza investigations with a cop. We all know the terminology. We're so into it. We're unable to explain the greater context. So most of the interviews for this with my father were done by Shoko and Amy because he assumes that they don't know. So he explains in terms that they can understand. And that made it much better. And a couple times I even had Benny, my daughter, come in and do some of the interviews or be there for the interviews because it gets him talking, not just about the case, but what he learned from the case. What were the lessons that he learned? And that was great. So in this podcast, the number of times I actually interviewed my father are very few, 2 or 3 times. Almost all of it was done by Shoko and Amy or Benny.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's actually a thing I learned, reminds me of a thing I learned when I started doing audio versus print, which is that you can use narration to explain things, but really you want your sources to do that. And in writing, you can write into your quotes and out of your quotes, and you can provide additional context in a way that doesn't work as well in audio. So you really need your sources to like talk to you as if you don't know anything, and in very granular, specific detail about this is when it happened and this is how I felt, and this is, which I imagine for the reason you just explained is quite hard because you and your dad have a shorthand, and also he just assumes you know a lot of the stuff, right? He's never going to be like, well, Jake, it was October of 1998, and I was in this building called 4 East, which is one of the main wings of the hospital. So yeah, I guess that's a clever fix for that, is that you kind of need someone else to talk to him.
And the other reason that the other reason that was really good to have Amy and Shoko along for the ride is Shoko is a great investigative journalist. But I've been doing this, Josh, for like 30 plus years, right? And I am a little insensitive. I mean, I just am, of dealing with horrible tragedies and murders and human trafficking and god awful stuff. Sometimes I'm not very good at empathizing or showing empathy with the people who are interviewing it. I understand it's a great loss, but it doesn't really come across. And Shoko and Amy are really good at relating to people and understanding them and showing compassion with them in both their voice and the manner that they address them that sometimes I lack. And I thought that was really good to have. It's not that I'm an asshole. It's just kind of, I fall into journalist mode, and sometimes I'm not as sensitive to people's feelings as I should be.
Yeah, it comes with the territory of covering dark cases, right? Dealing with tragedy, and you just get a little bit numb to it and try and be cognizant of it. But I think that makes a lot of sense. What about the difference between, you've now been working in Japan for how many years?
Since 1988. Wait, so as a journalist since 1993, so 30 plus years?
So your reporting in America muscles might be a little atrophied. Are there any differences that you noticed reporting this story versus the stuff you do in Japan?
One thing that is different that I was kind of shocking to me is that law enforcement here would never talk to you. I mean, even retired law enforcement really is hesitant to speak to you because in Japan, the public servants laws make talking about a confidential case something you can be arrested for or fired for. So, we never get people on the record. So to be able to talk to Kevin Crane, the former prosecutor, is still a judge on the record, I was just like, wow, you get to do this? Like, you will talk about this past case and you're still a judge and you're not retired and you're not afraid of repercussions. You'll say exactly what's on your mind. To me, that was totally like, wow, almost unheard of.
If only the FBI had been as cooperative as Kevin Crane.
Oh my God. I have dealt with a lot of FBI people over the years. And generally speaking, once they're retired, they love to talk about their past cases, even if they screwed up because they missed the limelight. No one we talked to on this case would actually speak to us on the record. Was amazing to me. I mean, I was like, what is going on? One of the things that's been very fortunate about this, not only do we have a lot of the materials Gordon Christensen collected, who was the physician who did the original epidemiological study that showed the patient shouldn't be dying. He had collected a bunch of stuff. But this lawyer we spoke with, who represent the Havram family who sued the VA hospital, he gave us all these documents to read through, which included 1,000 pages of FBI transcripts, interviews. And I'm reading through these. The agents are basically saying, what the fuck is going on with the Bureau? Like, why aren't we getting these toxicology reports back? Are they out of their mind? It's been like 2 years, like, what's going on? Get us an answer. Are we ever going to do this case? So you can see that there are people, very upset. And we heard some stories on this thing, I thought I knew everything about it. But there was a moment we were talking to former Representative Ken Jacob, who was on his way back to Hawaii and stopped in Japan. And we dragged him to a hotel and plied him with food, and we're like,
Not against his will, to be clear. You didn't actually drag him to a hotel.
Well, I mean, after using my small town connections to reach out to Ken, I was like, hey, Ken, you have this incredibly long layover in Tokyo, like 15 hours. Like, why don't you let us pick you up? We'll take you to a hotel nearby. You can lounge around, you can relax, we'll buy you food, drinks, whatever you want. You can do this tiny little interview with us. And he was like, okay. And the other thing is that, Josh, I know this isn't really relevant to the program, is I hate watching sports. I totally hate spectator sports. Don't watch them. I have no interest in them. I never have. I almost got fired covering high school baseball when I was a first-year reporter, which you also have to do as part of the police beat. Don't ask me why, because I did such a bad job. But he insisted that we watch the Super Bowl before we do the interview. So I watched my first Super Bowl, and I couldn't have given a shit who won. But because his team was winning and I knew that would put him in a great mood, suddenly I was very invested in the Super Bowl. I was like, all right, great. Congratulations. Cheers, Ken. Okay, let's do this interview. So he's a state legislator. He's the first one to call the FBI. And he told us, a couple weeks into the investigation about getting called by an FBI agent at his home saying, I need you to talk to someone close to the governor because they're trying to shut down this case and it shouldn't be shut down. Can you do something? And, that is such a weird thing for an FBI agent to do, or any special agent to do, to reach out to a legislator and say, hey, please don't let them close down our investigation. That gave me chills down my spine. And I don't think he knows what it meant. And I don't know what it means, but that's not standard operating procedure.
So what do you read into the retired FBI agents not wanting to talk about this?
Not only the special agents retired, there was the Department of Veterans Administration has its own special agents that do investigations. The classification is 1811. So one of those guys who did a really great investigation, Wayne Kessler, also, after reaching out to him many times, sent me the most cryptic text I've ever seen, which is, I am no longer speaking about this in any manner or form. I have my reasons. And that was it. That was the end of Wayne. My feeling is that someone in I think it would be the Clinton administration at the time, just wanted this swept under the rug. And that was communicated to Louis Freeh, who was the director of the FBI. And basically, they're just like, let's just let this die out. Let's just ignore this. Let's not do the toxicology. Let's just let it fade into oblivion so we don't have to deal with the controversy. That's my gut instinct. Can I prove it? I can't.
Yeah. And sadly, it could remain a cold case forever because I think it would be very hard to find definitive proof at this point, right?
It would be hard to find definitive proof. But, there have been cases in Columbia, Missouri, of people who've been disappeared and people have been convicted of murder without a body, without any evidence other than, circumstantial evidence. So nothing is impossible. Unlikely, but not impossible.
What are you doing next? Tokyo Vice ended after 2 very successful seasons. You have a new book that came out earlier this year and then another one coming.
Oh, so it's confusing. Tokyo Noir, the sequel to Tokyo Vice, as my friend Ben Dooley called it, the cash grab sequel to Tokyo Vice. Words of praise from a journalist. That is coming out October 1st. Because it's an Australian publisher, it was published in Australia first, but I would say the global release is October 1st. So that is coming out. I'm going to Los Angeles to do a book tour. I'm also coming to New York to do a very small modified book tour, but mostly to see my agent and hang out with friends. So, drop by the Campside media offices and pick up any remaining documents that are there.
So the book's coming out, and then is there talk of a sequel or additional seasons of the TV show?
There is nothing in the pipeline that I'm hearing about. But interestingly enough, I'm in the beginning stages working on another project about a book that I wrote a couple years ago, which is going to be about Yakuza and the FBI and cops, with the working title Hawaii Vice. I'm not kidding you. And we'll see where that goes. But so far, so good.
Well, I will be hopeful. It is a great title.
It is a great title. And I'm sure HBO will hate it, which is, they love you, man.
It's tough out there in the content mines.
It is tough out there in the content mines. I am very happy to be doing podcasts and writing books. I mean, that is my thing. But if someone wants to throw millions of dollars at me to make TV, I'm willing to compromise.
Duly noted. All right, it's 11:45 p.m. in Japan, I should note, and 10:45 a.m. in New York. So I should let you go to bed.
Thanks, Josh.
All right, Jake. Thanks, man. Thanks again to Jake and the rest of the Witness Night Shift team, and thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. Don't forget to head over to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.